Welcome to Journeys into Enlightenment with Janet. Join Janet and her friends as they gather at the intersection of consciousness and self-experience, what being consciousness in human form is all about. Access heart-centered awareness with them and feel the difference in the moment that will last a lifetime.
Hello, I'm Janet Barrett, and welcome to the fourth episode of Journeys into Enlightenment with Janet. Each episode, my friends, join you and me as we meet at the many intersections of consciousness, soul, and self. We access what I call heart-centered awareness, the field of unified consciousness, as the environment that you feel as you listen in. That means that we are engaged in fluid reality states, where potential is real and actively engaged in our senses of being in any one moment. As you listen in, you will feel things and thoughts and feelings soften, perhaps, or your body takes a deeper breath, or you feel the stillness and the quiet of sacred space. Sacred space is not so still. That is just the limits of how we usually notice ourselves in our day-to-day lives. The quantum realms that are within each of us, that our essences are, work differently. Time and space are malleable, and everything can be noticed in new ways. Time expands and seems to slow down, and information is present to be observed with one's inner eye, free of emotions, and our agendas of stories playing out. With this, the fourth episode, I am coming to know the form of this podcast and all its elements wanting to express themselves in each episode. I constantly am appreciating all the myriad of ways that there are to use words and feelings to acknowledge life. I look to provide you with us maybe using the same words in unique ways, reflecting the author's inner processes. It is all part of the whole. You may find you listen more than once to any one episode, as there is so much available to interact with in our inner worlds. You will hear something different, feel something different, sense something different each time as you open in awareness. It is all there in the field of unified consciousness. Have fun. Where we start with any one topic is only a starting place. What you feel is only a moment in your being, and we have many moments. Today's topic is consciousness, and what if it is a sense and not just a state? What happens when we reorganize our understanding and appreciation of consciousness? How does this influence our thoughts and emotions? In this episode, my friend Harvey Kraft and I will explore what happens when we unfold and open our minds to new orientations of being, following traditions of the past and its wisdoms. Our language and awareness is building resonance for us. Just relax, and the underneath energies are more vibrant than the words this time around. And I might mention, here are a couple of thoughts about ages and time that are showing up. Sometimes references are in BC and AD terms, and sometimes in eons and thousands of years, or maybe the present. Don't let it distract you. Here to start us off is Tom's meditation this episode. His story, her story, your story. Be sure to go to his extensive meditation archive at Interlude, an internet retreat, to enjoy it and much more.
History. Her story. Your story. Who doesn't like a good story? Humans are storytellers by nature. We've been doing it a long time. On cave walls, humans painted stories 30,000 years ago. Before there was writing, people told stories in song and poetry. After writing, we developed history and literature, and we had permanent stories. Now we have the news. Sometimes the news doesn't fulfill the need for completion that comes in a good story, so we have conspiracy theories that explain the mysteries that remain. Stories make sense of the world. Without a good story, a horde of Greeks would have trashed the city of Troy, but nobody would have remembered. Troy would have faded from memory, as did thousands of other ancient cities that were burned. But Homer had a story to tell that involved romance, scandal, heroes, danger, trickery, and conquest. The Iliad was such a good story that it produced the first sequels that we know of. The story made sense of extremely disturbing happenings. Sometimes we call stories myths. Usually the term is used to refer to stories attached to someone else's religion. When the story is our own, we may not notice that it is a story at all. It's our life. But we need to have a story. We need to be able to explain to ourselves how we got to be who we are. We lived with certain people and they treated us a certain way, and because of that we did certain things. We had consequences to the things we did, or we didn't have apparent consequences, and those events helped form our character. To know ourselves, which we must do to develop, we need to know the story that we have told ourselves. That doesn't mean we need to make one up. It means we need to recognize that we have created our own myth and that we are giving meaning to our life through it. Or perhaps the story is telling us that there is no meaning in our lives. That's when it's even more important to recognize the story. Here's an activity to try. Recognize your story. Think about your story. What do you tell yourself about what has happened in your life? Are there heroes and villains? Tragedy? Triumph? Humor? Is this an exciting story, or does it seem dull? Are there things in your story that you'd like to change? You might want to write the story. You might also make a timeline of events you consider important, and notice the emotions that are attached to those events. Here's a different activity. Break loose from the story. Recognize that you possess the human trait of making stories. The story will explain that things that happen to you are because of something or other. To some extent, you've figured out the way the world works and your place in it. The story may be simple or complex. You develop beliefs about who you are and who other people are and the way the world works. Try for a little while to stop doing that. For a few minutes or a few hours, seek to be mindful of your experience without creating a story about it. Observe your experience without attributing motives, placing blame, labeling yourself or others as heroes or villains. Take out for a while the winning and losing. Just notice what it is to be, to experience without interpretation.
Our friend Harvey Kraft, who joins me this episode, is a spiritual archeologist. That was a new term for me, which led me to wanting to know more. We met on my other podcast, Conscious Conversations with Joan and Janet, a few years ago. He talked about his book, The Buddha from Babylon, at the time, and it was a fascinating lesson about the life of Buddha and what he offered and still does today. Harvey has studied the spiritual and religious past that is in each of us, not outside of its context, but from within it. He is an author, speaker, and advocate of higher consciousness. He is adept at interpreting ancient mythic language, while fulfilling his personal quest to unearth the profound underlying meanings of Buddhist wisdom literature. His exploration of spiritual history has unearthed the ancient use of imaginative and creative envisioning as the key tool for personal transformation and collective evolution. He is the author of The Buddha from Babylon, The Lost History and Cosmic Vision of Siddhartha Gautama. It is a spiritual thriller and a historical epic, an exploration of the common roots of Eastern and Western religious beliefs, and a groundbreaking narrative of the Buddha's life and deep wisdom, with an enlightened ending. It embodies 15 years of extensive research and garnered from the USA Best Books Award a gold medal in 2 categories, World History and Eastern Religions. Recently, Harvey has been actualizing this practice by writing wisdom verses and posting them on social media. He is fascinated with it being possible to trigger consciousness within us into awareness, a thought I know to be true. He is also involved at this time with the applications of virtual reality technologies in the conception of consciousness enlightening storytelling. He is the perfect friend to help us expand our awareness of the unlimited essence that is consciousness within each of us. Hello. Harvey, are you there?
I'm here, Janet. Hello.
Thank you so much for joining me. You've got such a great bio, and I so deeply respect your journey, your personal journey of life, and how you've managed to call yourself a spiritual archeologist. I was so taken with your term, and in your writings about the Buddha and all these different things that you're engaging with about from a conscious place as consciousness. And what we were looking at was to talk about what if it was a sense, not just a state, and you had such, it was so juicy for us. So what I'd like to do, if that's all right with you, is engage those listeners, our wonderful listeners, to join us in this state, however they experience it. And then we'll just run with it. Sound all right?
Sounds good.
Okay, everyone. So just notice. Thank you for joining Harvey and me here. And you're there, I'm here, he's somewhere else. We're in all our different realities, but we say that we're here. And we feel ourselves here. And just notice what that feels like. You can call it whatever you like. For me, I refer to it as heart-centered awareness. So in just noticing all of these episodes are focused on letting this be seamless and effortless, and just you live this. You don't have a personal life and a professional life. You are. Those distinctions are very artificial, and they can get us into the situations that we're in, because we're looking at, and certainly Harvey is all about this, is about being congruent and expressing from our essence. So let's take this time and just notice what it'd be like to feel your heartbeat. And be grateful. It is telling you that you are alive in a body. And appreciating that. The body can feel very burdensome sometimes, physically or mentally or emotionally. And you just let go of it here. That's about self. We're talking about consciousness in our soul lives, essence. So feel that heartbeat. And then notice your emotional terrain, which is always the second meaning of heart. Emotions. We'll talk about emotions today and how they get engaged. So just notice you have several running and operating at any one time. And would it be like to be appreciative that you do have emotions? We hold them in all different regards. And in this state, you notice that it's not about a bias about them. There are the flavorings. They help determine how we experience what we experience. They set up our biases. They all work together. So notice the beating of your heart. Notice what you feel emotionally and let it go. And then go step into that third meaning of heart, the core essence of all, and step off into this place with Harvey and I. And just feel that, the releasing of your story. And Harvey's going to tell us all about stories and how important they are and how they generate reality and myth and all kinds of things. And just notice. There you go. and feel all those things shifting around and hear them shifting around, Harvey. So just relax it and just be on a cushion, be on a cloud, be wherever you are and feel it start to relax. Feel yourself start to engage. And that's where this conversation is held in. That's where these episodes are held in. And so you may notice distinctions. You may notice the softening of a thought, a new perspective. We're here to tantalize you, encourage you to question and be curious and enjoy your creativity of life. So, what you notice in there, Harvey?
Well, I'm traveling.
Yeah, I warned you.
Where we're heading, we'll find out soon enough.
So we got in this discussion about consciousness and what if it was a sensory experience, not just a state experience? And then what happens when we reorganize our understanding and appreciation of consciousness? And how does this influence our thoughts and emotions? And where do we start with that, do you think? Or someplace else totally different? That was just the starting place.
Well, that's a good place to start. I think that part of why I am an advocate for consciousness as a sense comes from my research work over the decades, and especially in regards to what people see as Eastern philosophy, where the idea of a sixth sense is naturally part of the culture that evolved in that part of the world, whereas a more Western view tends to be scientific, and so we tend to look at the five senses that we're all familiar with and use. And consciousness in that regard, from a scientific standpoint, interestingly enough, is something that's undefinable. When we talk about the sixth sense, there are all kinds of explanations regarding intuitive, visionary abilities and projections, and some people have it and some people don't, and some people have it this way and that way. But in reality, if you look at the sixth sense in an active modality, you can see that in terms of experience, consciousness is something that is active. For example, what we see or what we're conscious of relies on where we look. And just on that basis alone, so that we have some starting point here in regards to consciousness as a sense, I wrote a little verse called Look. And let me just share that with you. It'll take a few seconds.
Sure.
It says very simply, look behind, you'll learn from your mistakes. Look ahead, you'll open new possibilities. Look down, you'll connect with your roots. Look up, you'll see that nothing stands still. So here is the way
I
of
love
looking
it.
at
I love it. Yeah, right.
Right?
Yeah.
We look at consciousness, and it's not something necessarily ethereal.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's real.
It's something that's experiential.
Yes.
And because our experiences are a constant stream of consciousness, what comes in and what we do with it is also part of the sense of consciousness. So, for example, visually with your eyes, goes into your brain, into your mind, and and maybe you're smelling something. If it's a flower or cooking or whatever, all of these senses that we have, they're all collecting data.
Mm-hmm.
But
Okay.
somewhere in what we call the mind rather than the brain, there
Mm-hmm.
is an operating system that is taking all this input and creating a singular experience out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we call that singular experience what we're conscious of.
Right.
But it is dynamic. It
Mm-hmm.
isn't something that you stop and look at and say, "Oh, okay, I am now conscious of this," because the moment you say that, it's already gone. It's something you're now conscious of being conscious of being conscious. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It,
I totally got it there. Yeah.
okay, so what I'm trying to uh, uh, get across here is that based from our earliest ancient seers, okay, their view of consciousness was one in which they used it as a sense.
Mm-hmm.
So that, for example, when a seer would go into trance and would go into a visionary journey where they can see beyond what is in front of them, which all of our wisdom literature is written on that basis. All of that, what we might call a trip in some cases, is a function of consciousness being used in order to explore and then to discover and then come back and say, what is it that we discovered?
Okay, Harvey, right there, you've brought up so much information. And so that sounds like I'm totally comfortable with claircognizance, with knowing that has no human reference, or it's not my personal reference, but it's information out in the field that you can tag. And how that mind, because mind to me is the interpreter of soul and self, right? It's the one that's setting up how it's going to organize all its experiences that it feels, and it taking in all the information. And so what you're addressing is how in the past, in those indigenous cultures that are still present, and in the past, wisdom in people's experience was, if we look at consciousness as the self, then there's no separateness. There's no, and I can feel how that opened up when you mentioned it that way. It gave it a kind of a different context, a different flavor of integration and respect and value, and that, of course, this is this. Whoa, lots of noise there. Okay, so it integrates, unifies, brings together a whole lovely sense of organization. I really like this. This feels great. Thank you. Thank you very much. So continue, because we had my friend Mateo here, who is indigenous. I think she calls an indigenous systems practitioner. She lives among the indigenous people. She studied them. She's a doctor and stuff. And she brought the awareness that they don't have terms of body, mind, and spirit. It's all one spirit and soul that's being expressed in being here. And that sounds like this integration that you're talking about.
Right. That's why consciousness is such a difficult subject to convey.
Yeah.
Because there is no limit to the interpretations that people might take based on whatever their experiences and backgrounds are.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually consciousness at work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? In other words, consciousness is not a singularity. Consciousness itself is the system that is embedded in life itself. How do we know that? We know that let's say on Earth, life started from some kind of a unknown spark, and then evolution developed, and out of that evolutionary stream, we have what we call genetics today, which means that over the millions of years, there's been a constant flow and remake and adjustment being done by what?
The no thing, right?
The consciousness that is embedded in everything,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And this is why it's so difficult, because one of the things we tend to do with our minds is we try to observe, and we try to then describe what we're observing. Of course, we're using words to do that,
Right.
in order to do that. But yet, somewhere inside us, you know that it's always inadequate.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that story of the three blind men and the elephant, that you're going to get different stories of what an elephant is unless you're able to see the whole elephant.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
this is an ancient Jain parable, in essence, trying to um, trying to get at the heart of what this is all about. And interestingly, if you go to, say, the the ancient Buddhist sutras, and you look at how the Buddha, who lived 2,500 years ago, how he looked at it, he saw this whole thing as a system, life itself, existence. And people don't realize that the Buddha was the first one to propose the law of cause and effect, and that there is this universal system with various facets to it, some of which we're aware of, some of which we're not. But in the process of this, there is kind of a Buddhist psychology that he put forth, proposing that the mind is a system composed of an individual mind, a collective mind, and a universal mind. And
Got
these
it.
three minds, so to speak, are inseparable from one another.
Mm-hmm.
And what we call balanced mind is when these three branches of the mind are acting like checks and balances in a way that really works to create balance. People using any one of those three to the detriment of the other two, you see an imbalance in some way. So, for example, if all I can think of is myself and my needs, okay, I become obsessed with myself. We call that self-centered thinking, or we call that
Egotist.
whatever. Yeah, right. I mean, and
Egocentric. Egomaniac. I don't know.
egomaniac. We who are maybe more selfless will look at that person and essentially criticize them for that. Okay. Meanwhile, the person who tends to criticize that individual can be like 80-90% spiritual in their thinking, but they are like totally detached and observational. And so they're not really involved and engaged in their fullness. And then, of course, we have the collective view, in which we have the tendency to suspend our disbelief and call it belief. And so we hear some stories and we tend to follow that particular story. So part of the process of understanding consciousness is to understand that it is an active, always engaged, always on system, and one that requires navigation. And that's where we really come in. That's where we as a conscious being need to be able to explore, especially the fact that our higher consciousness is what takes us to realizations and truths, and that has to guide and navigate the collective and the individual consciousness if we are to find wisdom and joy and happiness and fulfillment in our life.
Okay, so everyone, just notice that there's a lot of sound available that we're hearing, and that that's part of us selecting out and where you're choosing to focus. And just notice how where you are with that, and how it is part of the whole. There are many things out that we listen to and get tuned to. And this is about tuning in a different way. It's about having a different on your knob of up or down or interpretive or all kinds of knobs that knob can be. Setting it for something different. Just a little bit different. And to see what you hear then. See where the clarity shows up. And Buddha and what his structure that followed him is massive. Mm-hmm. And you can feel that how he organized, and Harvey's been able to look at all this and explore this, and the setups, and how in different languages and different cultures we have different values, and we can essentially are always talking about the same thing where the labels might be a little different. So listen to from the heart, right? And you hear where the mind can go a little confused, but you go back to heart and you just feel it. You understand in a different way, not because of mind telling you that this is what it means, but in releasing that so that you can feel the connection and the understanding and the appreciation of dynamics. And thank you, Harvey, for bringing that to my attention, because the show is always focusing on all the myriad of expressions and how we're nothing new to being here, that we can come from, whether it's a whale that's been here for 35 million years or Buddha 2,500 years ago and everything in between. What is new is only the appearance of it, but what underlies it is the consistency of consciousness at our essence. So now what do we notice, Harvey?
So when we're talking about people like the Buddha, I want to clarify that I am not talking about this person in terms of religion.
Okay.
I am talking about how ancient times, the mind itself, the power of consciousness, was recognized to be an implementation tool that equates with the technologies that we have today. And
then what? I lost you.
Then some. Beyond,
and then some. Okay.
Words,
yeah.
The enlightened consciousness is something that includes our capabilities that we use with technology like a telescope or a satellite or
a Skype.
Right?
But, Skype phone line.
Exactly. But is more than that. And one of the things I hope to convey here is the profound fortune that we as human beings have to get to the point where we can self-reflect on the fact that we carry a system within us beyond the system that just keeps us alive, which is,
Mm-hmm.
how
Right.
does that all
Yeah, the function of
happening,
body, right? So,
right?
yeah.
But that consciousness in this regard, especially when we speak about the higher consciousness, that this is something that was discovered long, long ago. And for me personally, as a writer and researcher, what astounded me the most was that the oldest literature that we have since the beginning of civilization, some 5,000 years ago, when human beings began to settle for the first
Mm-hmm.
time,
Mm-hmm.
and the very first cities had a temple in the center, which meant that the religious people, the seers, they were the ones who were in charge, even before we had political authorities
Okay.
who
All
came
right.
over and took over. But the point was that what drove was a group of spiritual people who were also the writers, who were the storytellers.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
we see, like, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was chiseled on tablets 5,000 years ago, is a mythological story, but it has embedded in it profound wisdom. So
Mm-hmm.
one would consider that literature to be among the most advanced literature ever.
Hmm.
It's like equivalent to Star Wars, but even more so because of where it takes us.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
how is it that civilization begins at what we would consider in hindsight a primitive time, when
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden these stories appear that are psychologically and spiritually so profound right off the bat?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is an indication of the importance of stories to the development of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
That stories themselves have an interaction in the mind with consciousness. Stories
Mm-hmm.
are ways in which consciousness can store and take in very deep wisdom. And
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that, these ancient seers embedded these discoveries in these early stories.
Do you think it's part of culture at the time? With there was an immediacy in life. There was instant information available, where today we can get all caught up in process and stuff and life and blah 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 blah. Where what you're describing to me sounds very much that those small groups, those clans, those small communities in their formation, really that was everything right there. And it was their connection of how they related in that to the land around them, to the heavens above them, to the earth below them, with such an immediacy. Do you get what I'm
Yes, I
noticing
do.
here?
I do. And first of all, the oxygen in the air was,
Pure.
cleaner. The mind, the, think of just the word awe, right? If I'm
Yeah.
living at that time, I am awed by the fact that the sun keeps coming up every morning.
Yeah. What is
I,
that thing?
I am awed by the fact that I put a seed in the ground and boom, I
Yeah.
get food.
Yes. Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
Things
Yes. Yeah.
that we relatively take for granted today because we're so distracted
Yeah.
by things that are,
Uh-huh.
I would
Uh-huh.
say, deceptive stories in most cases,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to really being connected with nature in terms of nature being a system with order. And so
Mm-hmm.
what they feared the most was the if nature is interrupted, if
Mm.
the order with which, you can't do farming unless you can predict what is
Yes.
going to happen.
Uh-huh.
And
And
so
where and
and
what?
where.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, the creation of this notion of gods at that time was these are all forces of nature. The
Mm-hmm.
sun, the moon, the wind, the storm, the air, the water, the stars. They were
Mm-hmm.
all gods.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And what they meant by gods was forces that
Mm-hmm.
were part of the system. And so what this meant was this was a consciousness
Mm-hmm.
of opening your eyes, opening your mind, and seeing the huge system that we are living in. Even at the smallest level, we are still a part of something so much bigger, and trying to understand how we and that all work together is what these stories were about.
So, it okay, in right in this moment, as you so deftly express that, the awareness in me is always that this is still present. That essence, what this man on in those times experienced was being breathed, where you hear this reference, because it was so permeable. Being was such a permeable state still. And you had all these forces at play, and whatever you called them, God, force, whatever the language would become, really is going back to your awareness that this is that feeling, this is that feeling, this is that feeling, and I'm feeling all these different things. And the label I put on it is part of the whole that sometimes we don't always see or recognize. And what I'm noticing in this moment is that connection, that clear, that simple, and that when we today talk about essence, this is what is present. This is this connection, free of all the filters, free of all the chatter, free of all the chaos. But this is our essence. And that individual, that DNA material is active within us.
Right. So
Yeah.
given that,
Yeah.
and I'm going to
Yeah.
quote you.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to quote
Good or
you.
bad? I don't know. Okay.
You said humans are self-defining creatures.
Yeah.
So by that, this notion of self-defining again is not a static thing. We are
Oh, yes. 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 Right.
constantly redefining.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let's go back. How do we do that? We go back to what we started with, which was where are you looking?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to give you another short little
Mm-hmm.
bit of a
Okay.
verse here called the
Uh-huh.
stories, because this shows you how we look back, we look at the now, we look forward, and where we look is a very important part of what we see
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how we
Right.
process that.
Mm-hmm.
The stories we inherit tell us about the wisdom extracted from challenges encountered before we were born. The stories we follow now show us what is going on in an ever changing world as we strive to make sense out of senselessness. The
There you go.
stories we imagine in the future stretch our current capacity for wonder and aspiration to help us create what will happen as our world evolves. The stories flowing from and into our higher consciousness are with us always, past, present, and future, filling our minds with revelations of what we must face to become the best version of ourselves.
Well, that kind of says it succinctly, doesn't it? Good for you, Harvey. And you gave it a great form. Right. That's what it's all about. Is our ability to not constantly, or I guess it has a sense of constantness or consistency, or is that life is a never-ending what are the words here? It's a never-ending roller coaster of choices, right? You're in perpetual motion, and that we lose all those distinctions and awareness, and it moves into habituated responses. And what we're bringing us back to here is that, yes. So what if it was you sat on this side of the roller coaster seat? And what do you notice there? And you're still in your experiences, but I know that from being in that side of the seat, I'm going to see something different. I'm going to feel something different. I'm going to be something different when I get off. And then the next time I'm on that ride, I'm sitting backwards. Oh my gosh. And the next time I'm standing up. And whatever it is, not that I recommend that you do that in real time on a roller coaster, but in the perspective, and in the perspective is our choice. It's how we're going to choose to frame the bias, the perceptions of what we each are. And this sheer joy that Harvey's describing out of old beginning wisdoms and current wisdoms is that it's still alive. You are alive. And that means so much, because you can be doing something else, but right in this moment, you can be feeling changes. And those things are different. Good job, Harvey. Ooh, I like it.
So that the verse, I keep wanting to integrate our entire conversation wherever we are now, because the verse also is reflective of the consciousness that we have as an individual, as a collective, as a universal. So there is, in all of us, we are all at once, an I, a we, and an all.
Yes.
Okay? So the full scope of your consciousness is as an I, we, and all. So how you look at various things when you say you have choices and you make decisions, it's all within taking everything into account.
Yes.
That's what the higher consciousness does. Okay? Takes takes everything, all of your personal experiences, all of our collective experiences and beliefs, and then gives it even something grander than that, which is something we generally refer to as wisdom. Something like what you just said. That kind of wisdom arises from being able to integrate your consciousness into something we call wisdom. Right?
Yeah, and you know what that is? That is unity. That word just comes to mind when you were describing man in his beginnings there. There was a unity in being in his environment. All those three different minds, all those three different references were all in one place, working together and integrating. And that is unity.
Exactly. Now, that doesn't happen so easily, does it?
Well, we can have, this is our journey of enlightenment, Harvey.
Right? So that's why we get, okay, this is going to take some doing. And one of the things that we have to face is the constant barrage of distractions and various immersions and sufferings that are also part of life.
Right.
They're not an accident that's happening to us. Okay? It's all part of what life is doing, which is promoting its agenda. What is the agenda of life? Let me try to give you a quick idea of what that might be. Okay?
All right.
The agenda of life is to help us evolve to fully develop our capabilities in regards to what we're capable of doing with our life.
Mm-hmm.
Because the word life is interchangeable with enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And in ancient language, it's exactly what that is. When
Ah.
we talk about ancient enlightenment, what is the enlightenment of the Buddha?
Yeah.
It is the absolute merger of consciousness as a recognition of life being the light that we all talk about.
Got it.
It's the light, it's the spark that takes it, it's life that makes, is a force itself. Life force is the force that makes it possible for our biology to work, for the entire system of consciousness, for the universe to come to be, for everything you can possibly think of. And throughout all of that is a very interesting little item called emotion.
Yeah, the rudder. I think the rudders that I can see from the way you're describing this. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So if you look at, at certain like ancient teachings, like people think, oh, if I detach myself from desires, if I essentially take away all emotions, all yearnings, everything that I want out of the picture, then by divorcing myself from suffering, I am enlightened.
Ah!
Guess what?
Yeah, right.
It's an illusion.
Yeah.
Because the system itself is the system of life, is the enlightenment. So if you disengage from life, you're disengaging from enlightenment. The Buddha said it's like burning the seed of your enlightenment, and a seed that's scorched cannot grow.
Ah, okay.
So yet what we have, not only from the Buddha, but of many other religions, is this notion that love, compassion, and selflessness are not just expressions of feelings, but they are tools for enhancing consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They'll certainly enhance your individual experience, won't they?
Right.
Yeah.
But they can also do great confusion and
right.
suffering. So it's like, and that's the beauty of this dynamic of consciousness, is just like you might be confused about this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But somewhere in there, you might be also getting some nuggets of wisdom that might be useful to you, even if you don't realize it.
Right. Right.
By the same token, I'm sorry.
Seeds. We're planting seeds, Harvey.
We're planting seeds, exactly.
They may sprout, they may not.
That's why Jesus or Buddha or any other leader, they always planted the seeds by espousing love and compassion and selflessness, right? So this is all part of tooling people up to be able to experience rather than intellectually try to understand consciousness. These are methods by which we experience consciousness.
You know, Harvey, what I'm struck with is when you mention compassion, and what were the 4 words? Compassion, love,
compassion, and selflessness.
Selfishness. That it's the lack of those that lead us astray. And it feels astray, but what it is that's the contrast.
Well, we haven't developed our higher consciousness, or we haven't used it. In other words, they're all part of the software.
Yeah, and what happens, though, is when you feel the lack of these.
You don't use it, you lose it.
You use it, you lose it, and then you want it. And someone else has it, and I want it. And you call it this, and I want it. And what you're doing is you're coming out of a sense that you are not enough, that there is a lack. And so something that is a given, right? Because these are the principles that underlie consciousness, apparently, as life, that you're always in relation to them, and everything you express is in relation to them, and how you experience life is in relation to them. And so it's a matter of where you are on the spectrum or the continuum of any of those. You have a sense that you have it, so you can pass it on because you can feel it. You have a sense that you want it because you know what it feels like and you've lost it. I mean, there's all these different ways, and there's all that incredible emotional terrain,
Right.
is how
And
you
once
relate
again,
to all those.
but it's the point being that it still needs to be recognized in terms of
Yes.
the entire system of life and existence. In other words, it in and itself is not separate. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like, sometimes we want to say, oh, the mind is the center, or the heart is the center,
Mm-hmm.
or there is no center,
Right.
okay?
Yeah.
Because what you're
It's all
talking
at once. Right.
is
Exactly.
a system, right?
Yeah.
And when you look at systems, you go, what's the center of the system? There's you.
It's
It's
the
almost like
operating principle. That's the center, right? Is what it is. It might not be a place.
well, center the center itself is a relative concept,
Right. And that's self. That's
right?
self.
It's relational, right?
Right.
It's like
Right.
center compared to when related to something else that you feel is
Right.
outside of that.
Right.
So the point being that our emotions, right, they can lead us to confusion, suffering, all kinds of different things that we consider to be unhealthy, but they're also a challenge that we can use in order to evolve.
Right.
And when we evolve our consciousness, then the consciousness begins to strengthen. We become more discerning. We begin to see
Mm-hmm.
through our consciousness. It's like consciousness vision as opposed to eye vision.
Mm-hmm.
We begin to see things in a certain way, some of which can best be described through poetry.
Okay. One thing I
So
want
that's
to
poetry.
one thing I want to mention here, Harvey,
Yeah.
is that it's identifying these four principles or essences or colorations or however we want to frame it. And it is also how how they in their purity are in their own essence, not the flavoring that humanity will bring to it, that the individual, the emotional will bring to it. It is what they are in their purity, and that's the drama. That's the trauma. That's the joy. That's the relationship is there. Because you and I can use words like love. That means a whole lot of different things to a whole lot of people, and it's mostly an experience of bias. And like anything can be. So when we're talking about it, we want to recognize that if it was free of your emotional restraints and constraints and limits and definitions, what is that essence of it? And now can you find that within yourself? And how you navigate through life is how you hold on to this sense of purity that is part of what life is.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that we also have in terms of our evolutionary path is to evolve our emotional self.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And an aspect of that kind of evolution is to be able to see it through wisdom. So,
Mm-hmm.
what you just described was absolutely beautiful, and I thought, oh, as you're saying it, this is a perfect segue for another one of these verses. And
Okay.
this is a poetic one, but I think
Uh-huh.
it'll hit the mark in terms of what we're
Okay.
talking about, in terms of
Okay.
understanding the heart, not simply as a mechanical device that keeps pumping the blood,
Right.
but something that, from once you see it from a consciousness standpoint, takes on a whole different idea. And so this piece is called "The Heart is a Red Forest."
Okay.
Here you might hike under the canopy of love, or get lost in the thicket of love, because because the heart is a red forest. Here you might feel lost or confused when love hides behind a tree, or you might find the trail when love calls out for you, because the heart is a red forest. Here you might drink from the stream when love flows from you, or smell the wild flowers of love when you are fulfilled, because the heart is a red forest.
Okay. Harvey, that's just wonderful. And I have a feeling, sweetie, that is just a great place to we're going to have to call time here. And would you come back and we could talk about emotions? We didn't get to we introduced it, and now what do you do with them, right? Would you be open to doing that in the future?
Oh yeah, we can, we could probably talk again, I would imagine.
All righty. So everyone just notice, because that was a lot of, just so deeply rooted in our being. Mm-hmm. And you got the CTGA, what is that in that DNA code there, those letters that resonate in this? This is what's encoding them. And how they orchestrate and build their patterns is unique to each of us. But at center, probably we could tag those 4 words with those elements of the DNA and notice how they interact. Oh, wow. That's just massive. I love that direction this is taking, Harvey. So thank you so very much. So very much.
My pleasure to be able to share with you, Janet, and I appreciate your invitation to share this with your audience.
Oh, thank you. Your attention, please. You remember that I mentioned in past episodes about what might show up during our conversations. We have a fine example of this here as I listened in again crafting this episode. Towards the end of our conversation, Harvey is talking about the 3 foundations of essence: compassion, love, selflessness. But I was tracking 4, and you may notice this. What is the unknown 4th foundation awareness that came to me? I will share it in a bit. Keep listening for it. Harvey shares with us 3 wisdom verses among the many he is posting on LinkedIn and Instagram. You can find all the specifics relevant at my website podcast page at janetandbeyond.com for episode 4. I am happy to voice his verse again about noticing what life is around you. Look behind. You'll learn from your mistakes. Look ahead. You'll open new possibilities. Look down. You'll connect with your roots. Look up. You'll see that nothing stands still. He also mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is perhaps the oldest written story on Earth. It comes to us from ancient Sumeria and was originally written on 12 clay tablets and cuneiform script. It is about the adventures of the historical king of Uruk, and somewhere between 2750 and 2500 BCE. Here are 3 great quotes Harvey is sharing with us. I've organized them in chronological order from life 2,500 years ago, in 1897, and the present. He who experiences the unity of life sees his own self in all beings, and all beings in his own self, and looks on everything with an impartial eye. The Buddha. Properly speaking, the unconscious is the real psychic. Its inner nature is just as unknown to us as the reality of the external world, and it is just as imperfectly reported to us through the data of consciousness is as the external world through the indications of our sensory organs. Sigmund Freud, The Interpretation of Dreams, from 1897. If your mind carries a heavy burden of past, you will experience more of the same. The past perpetuates itself through lack of presence. The quality of your consciousness at this moment is what shapes the future. Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now, A Guide to Spiritual Enlightenment. I am laughing again. In the following blog, you will hear what I wrote as I was putting this episode together, without hearing which meditation Tom was going to choose to share with us. As I craft any episode, I give Tom my impressions of what that episode will be about. He then goes through his extensive archive and he makes his choice. He then records it for me to add into the mix. Tom wrote his meditation, History, Her Story, and Your Story, in 2009. And that was the last time I read it, and a lot has happened in my life in the intervening 10 years. I appreciated it then, and I'm laughing now here in 2019, for so much of it will sound the same as what I have written. God is laughing, as if that doesn't show the malleable qualities of time and space. I don't know what does. And who knows? Maybe I was channeling, downloading, or just tapping into the field. It doesn't really matter. It was just a lovely surprise of laughter. Do you hear the laughter? My blog is Consciousness and the Connections in Our Storytelling. We are natural storytellers. As relation-based creatures, our stories define us and give us placement to our surroundings. This is very important to the self. Whether in our physical or non-physical realms, self needs to know how to relate. Self seeks place. Writing started around 5,000 years ago. When we did not yet write, we verbally communicated in sounds and eventually language. Our ancestors drew to express what they were noticing in their environments, be it sun, horse, family, and the squiggles of water, and even signed their works as a handprint. Everything you know today about yourself and you don't know about yourself is story that has become myth. It is a projection subject to interpretation, along with the many years that man has been present. Our DNA tells us stories of connection that we most often have no knowledge or proof of. We are developing our technology to help us explore our past and ways for us to know ourselves in terms of that past. We can also know ourselves in terms of the past, present, future by accessing our essence within each of us, to know ourselves as soul and consciousness, free of the dictates of our assumptions and stories and myths and rumors of self and our appearances. Man started out relatively not too long ago in the big scheme of things. We can now have knowledge of the fact that what is walking around today in its suits and ties and colorations of skin tone is a culmination of a Homo sapien African woman and her daughters eons ago mixing with other humanoids. That progression is fascinating to many, and how we have all become what we see in the mirror each day and over time in our diversity. What shapes us are our stories in being and form. Most often we each look like we feel, how we think, and how we interpret our spirit as human. Our souls embrace the experience where the self may question it, and it is the one feeling all of it. Consciousness and soul are neutral to what those experiences are. We create what life is as an expansion of being. We each are adding into what is present today in our stories of culture and personality within this planet's grace. We are self-creating, self-defining presences of a dynamic in being. We form actively, knowingly, with intention as soul, and most of the time unknowingly from our habituated states of awareness as self. We fulfill our destinies as we decide them. All of this speaks to how we view life and our engagement with it. There is no bias in life, as it is an evolving dynamic. Life continues to develop in the human as embryo into fetus only when another chemical process engages and expands the form, bringing it into life as human. The same goes for a seed into flora, a roe as a developing fish. At any time, the form can stop developing and the form dies. Only 20% of all conceived human life bursts into a hopefully bouncing baby. Life stops or can continue with new variations present from the norm. Free of our emotions, we can appreciate life as nothing more than life, fulfilling the range of experience unique to the design inherent in that form. And souls are dancing. These days, I sense that most of what we would call our lives is about our relation to what is in our essence already as compassion, love, selflessness, and unknowingness. Our stories are filled with this relation to our core. Unknowingness is another name for potential. Nothing is yet known or identified or solidified into something as energy. It is the dark matter in the state of consciousness at play. It is always present in consciousness, yet we may not recognize it as it is unknown. It is the fourth element that showed up in my conversation with Harvey. Many of us don't like unknowingness, but it is what is beyond our limits and where we dance lightly. It is essential to our evolving stories. Please go to the janetandbeyond.com podcast page to see all the elements for this episode in detail, including Harvey's contacts. My first conversation with Harvey and his sharing his work, The Buddha from Babylon, The Lost History and Cosmic Vision of Siddhartha Gautama, is also available at my website podcast page, where you can access all the shows I co-hosted as Conscious Conversations with Joan and Janet. His link to the Buddha from Babylon is buddhafrombabylon.com. Thank you for joining me here at Journeys into Enlightenment with Janet. You can continue to join us every 2 weeks here on the CTR network. You can post any questions or comments there or email me directly at janetandbeyondpodcast.com. For more information about all the elements that make up each episode, they are on my podcast page at my website, www.janetandbeyond.com. You will also find information there about my other podcast show, Conscious Conversations with Joan and Janet, and about my work with clients. You can sign up to receive my regular weekly blog, Life in the Beyond, Journeys into Enlightenment. You will also find out about the Fuzzy Photons playground groups I offer. Live interactive space via Zoom video conferencing on your favorite device on Thursdays. If you're looking for other regular opportunities to sit in heart-centered awareness with others and explore life, you will find it here. You can follow each episode of this podcast series on my YouTube channel, Journeys into Enlightenment with Janet Barrett. Till the next time, feel the difference in this moment. It is real, and it can last a lifetime.